Go, go, go. So, hello people, my name is Unnarsted Setriksson, or PrismX, which is the non-Moonspeak version of my name. I'm a database developer with CCP, and we are going to go over the static data export, and I titled this presentation Why Cross the Wire, because that's pretty much what we're going to be avoiding in the end. This is the overview of the lecture. We're just going to do a quick primer on how to get your hands on the static data dump and just how the first steps of using it. Can I ask a question to the audience to begin with? How many of you are actually familiar with the SDE already? Yeah, most of you, but not all. Though, is anybody here who is actually doing some Eve applications and is not using the SDE at all? Oh, that is awesome news. Well, okay, ruining it for me. Oh. Okay, to go over, we will go over some basic query examples on how to dig into the SDE and get some meaningful data out of it. This might be a very basic thing for many of you who are already using it, but the point here is to get people into it so they actually can dig into it and can give us some comments on what other stuff they would like to see in the future. You'll need some basic understanding of SQL for that, as it says there in the slide. This is the scenario that we were talking about. You have an application server and some happy, smiley users, which you want to keep happy and smiley. You have some storage, and you're talking over the wire to the Eve API, which tons of other apps are also talking to. And the official requirements for the SDE, and I mean, this is the official version of the SDE. There are many other than third-party SDEs that are, you know, MySQL dumps of our static data dump. And if you don't know SQL, then it's my opinion that you can really just sit down with patience and learn it for yourself. It is really not that complicated, but yeah, and it's basically what I did when I was younger. So yeah, exactly. So it's just patience and the intention and willingness to learn. Microsoft SQL Server 2008 is necessary to actually use our official static data dump, but for any of the unofficial kind, you just have to pick up whatever works for that. We can't support that, and you can't really ask us questions about it because we work in a Microsoft world. But you are, of course, free to pick up whatever version that fits your requirements. There's a link there that you can use when you get your hands on the presentation to get the Express version of the Microsoft SQL Server. So we're pimping their products. And with that, you get the nice Microsoft Management SQL Server, MSS SQL SMS. It's a horrible acronym, but really fun. Okay, so where to get your hands on this dump is that you go to our homepage, eveonline.com, which is your homepage, of course. Under Toolkit, under the community, on the left menu, you'll find the Toolkit link, and there you can actually download both the SDE and all the icon dumps. And here is a picture of this little thing, and you'll see right there, this is the data dump. These here are then the icon dumps. Around, where is it? Here is a mention of an IRC channel called Eve Dev, which I recommend for anybody who is starting development on Eve applications, because as Atlas said, there is absolutely no documentations on our behalf, and the people there have spent the last 4 or 5 years cracking up our architecture so they can actually do some meaningful data, and they will meaningful applications, sorry, and they'll help you out. If you're nice, they'll play nice. So, once you get your hands on the static data export, you should start off by opening up a file which comes with it called ebs-datadump.sql. It contains the entire object definitions of all tables there, and there are foreign keys there as well. So if you apply them to the database, it'll probably error out because it's not properly sanitized. But in the off chance that you actually can apply them, then you can probably use them to make some sort of a relational chart between the objects and get a better, clearer picture of what's going on. The reason that the foreign keys are just listed there is just for your sake. We don't actually have any. Thank you, sir. We actually don't have any foreign keys on any of our databases. We used to have foreign keys in our authoring database, but our data versioning system kind of got in the way of that, so we just dropped that, and now we're running wild and crazy. You'll notice also that they're all categorized with the first 3 letters, with the exception of the planet tables. They, for some reason, have planet in front of all of them to ruin the nice schema we have. But you can see how this translates: CHR for character, DGM for dogma. I don't know if you know really what dogma actually stands for, but you'll hopefully learn something about that in the coming lectures. I'm not going to go very well over this, but if you just open up the data dump and take a look at it, take a look at the EBS data dump.sql, you'll see what I'm talking about. And hopefully it'll simplify stuff for you. So if you just look at there's no way to get into the data dump without just opening it up and starting to look into it. There's no magical pill you can take and suddenly you understand everything. When I started at CCP, I had to start off by just digging into the database and learning how everything relates to everything. So here's a quick example. Star stations is our primary stations table. It contains all the information about the stations, and there's way more than just what's on the screen there. It's too big to actually fit into the horizontal pane of the screen. You never do select star though, so just actually select what you want to see. And the station name is the only thing we're actually interested about here, because we want to list all research and manufacturing lines within stations. Order by station name, just for some sort of ordering. You can never really trust the ordering. But this is what we want. We want the assembly lines. So we find a table there called RAM assembly line stations, and it doesn't really describe what it is, but you start to learn slowly what all the tables mean. Joining on the station ID, you get the assembly line type ID, which isn't understandable at all. This won't help anybody looking at like, oh, okay, so there's some Joe Navy testing facility with 10 of assembly line type IDs 5. Doesn't work. So we have to go and find the table to actually translate this to a readable form. And then you will see these the name here appears instead of the ID, because we changed ALS assembly line type ID over to ALT assembly line type name. You can also see the official CCP database coding convention at work right there. I don't know if it makes any sense to you. It doesn't really make sense to many of us except me. I love my job. And now we add in the regions just so we can actually see what regions we are in, because not everybody knows what region a given system is in. And that's the Joe region. Ordering by the region first, the station name, and then the type. Maybe a different approach to this what we saw there was we started out with a set and then we just added stuff into it to get the data we wanted. That's not always the approach you can take. If we think about listing out all blueprints and their tag levels, then we start with looking at the inventory categories, and this is the inf schema is how we categorize all our types. For an example, a rifter is a frigate, which is a ship. So it's a category ship, type frigate, group frigate, type rifter. Looking at this here, you get this little list of categories. I actually cut off some part of the stuff there to just show you this. But you can see that number 9 is the blueprints, and then you start out with this single little record there. Joining onto the groups table, you'll get a list of all the groups which are blueprints, and it starts showing up like this, a cloned blueprint, which nobody has any clue what is, because there is no cloned blueprint to the game. As you can see, the static data export contains everything which we have thought about at any other point, because we don't really like cleaning up after ourselves. Nobody does that. Moving on, we go into the types tables to list out all the types of blueprints, because that's what we're interested in. And then we end up with this little bugger. You'll see this published bit there. It's not very meaningful. Stuff which is published 0 can still exist in the game. However, you won't be able to search for it in contracts. So yes, that's pretty much all the meaning that I've been able to put into this bit. But this is not the tag level. In order to look at the tag level, we have to actually dig a bit deeper into this export. And now we're in the dogma system. And I have no idea what the attribute ID of the tag level of a type is. So I had to look into the actual listings of attribute types. This, sorry. To make this even more convoluted, you can see there the 422 is the tag level of types. To make this more convoluted, we also have a table called dogma type attributes. That is not to be confused with dogma attribute types. One denotes the types of attributes, and the other is the attributes of types. It makes perfect sense, doesn't it? All right, so now with this, we actually can get the tag level of the blueprint. You'll see that this is null stuff there. is just because sometimes we use the integer column to keep the dogma value. Sometimes it's the float value, and we're not really consistent with it. So this is pretty much what we have to do for every look into that table. And then we just overwrite if there is no record for it, then we just overwrite as tag level 1. And of course, I noticed that I have only tag level 1 stuff there, so you don't actually see this in action. But believe me, this works. All right, this was our quick primer on how to get into the SDE. And if you're not familiar with it, you just have to bite the bullet, sit down, and look into it. Like the gentleman over there said, SQL isn't that hard. You just need the patience and willingness to learn. Sorry? Oh, yeah, exactly. See, we all have summer vacations. We can all learn SQL. So what do we use the SDE for? I mean, we don't use the SDE at all. The SDE is just a dump from our basic data master database with all the static data that CCP authors. But it's as it's dumped from our master authoring database, it has no knowledge of anything that's happening on Tranquility, and that might make people think that it's completely useless because you're not really interested in looking at static data. You like meaningful data. But this ships with all our server code, and this ships with all our client code, because it's the stuff that we use to make code understandable to the user. Because you won't know that, or maybe you do know that JITA is actually Solar System ID 30,142, but it's nicer just to say JITA rather than that number, and have to remember all of this. So it is actually quite useful. And what it's useful for is, if you look at this generic API response, this is the asset list of a character that I created on my local server, so that owner ID does not translate to my character. There's no owner ID there. Oh, that's beautiful. At any rate, when you look at this, this is the asset list for some character, and you see these type IDs there, 3709, 9850, and 25373. This is nonsense, and the end user would like to see it. So there is this API called character name.xml.aspx, where you can send in a string of types and request that back. But that's really not a good idea. You're not going to be doing this. This is the reason for why you would have a static data export to begin with, is so that you can do this locally on your application and not cross the wire over to us. And the reason for that is this. Thank you. I was wondering where that slide went. We like to have the API responsive. I mean, there you have a 2-second max response time, which is garbage, in my opinion. I get really pissed off when, websites take more than a millisecond to load up. Like, if I feel it's taking time to load up, it pisses me off. So if you're waiting for 6 minutes for something to time out, you're not going to have happy, smiley faces connecting to your applications. It's just going to be really angry users who won't use your application. And this is actually a really good example, because this lower picture, this is by the way taken from avsco.net with permission from the people there. But this is actually what happened, this picture down here. And you'll see that I don't think you can read these numbers, but these are actually close to 6 minutes up here, the big spike, and then it goes down. This is what happened when somebody started to scrape this call character names for every single ID in Eve to get a list of all types and all characters and all corporations and everything. And it took us a while to figure out what was going on. We blocked him. Everything was fine after that. But you don't want to risk this unnecessarily. You don't really know the quality of service that we provide you at any given point, and you want to have some control over your quality of service yourself. So now we're going to move over to talking a bit about the core concepts of Eve. And this is mostly going to be about how we see the world, really, as developers of Eve, and how concepts connect together. And if you've been working a lot in the Eve development, you'll actually probably have full knowledge of this anyway. If not, then it's going to be gold. So most of the stuff that you see in Eve are considered items. And items have a set of basic attributes, and then the item's type, which is a basic attribute of all items, denotes a lot of other auxiliary attributes. So you can think of a station, the Amara station, that's a type, and therefore it exists in star stations as well, with a station ID, with a station ID that is exactly equal to its item ID in other tables. So the bottom point there, which mentions that the item is not necessarily a tangible entity, and that's because corporations are also items, and the corporation is only an abstract concept within the game, but we still consider it an item. So here is a little nice blue circle of the set of all items in Eve, and some examples that you can just read over. You'll see that the universe itself is actually an item. There is an item of item ID 9, which is the universe, and it contains all the regions, which contains all the constellations, which contains all the systems, and they all then contain all the celestials. Your character is an annoying special case. We'll get to that later, but his skills, all of the skills that he has, they are items as well. Missiles are items as well. As soon as you fire it, an item is created, but it's not a database item. It's this concept of the item goes throughout the entire application. So even though it never goes to the database, it's an item for its 3-second lifespan of going and blowing up that rifter you were shooting at. And yeah, so are the rats. They are actually items, just ship items that fly around. And just in case you're getting bored, wake up. Another concept in the game is the owner. And as mentioned before, all items are owned by something. They might be owned by something completely nonsensical to you, just a system owner, but everything has to be owned by something. And there are static owners, and there are non-static owners. But the nice thing about owners is that they have to have names, and those names really don't ever change, unless somebody names his character something horrible, and a GM has to step in and rename it back to Galante Citizen, blah, 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 blah. Fancy little trivia, which you might have noticed, that if you get renamed to Galante Citizen something, then it's actually Galante Citizen, your character's character ID, which is his item ID as well. So, yeah, funny fact. As all items have to be owned by something, oh, sorry, I already covered this. Yes, the owner name is static, and this is an important thing we get to later, and CCP Atlas will get to as well, is that you can save yourself a lot of pain by just assuming that owner names don't change at all, because they hardly ever do. Some little examples of what actually is an owner, and I added this nice little set theory, the set of all owner items, which is a subset of all the items in Eve. Corporations actually have a meaningful owner. They're owned by their CEO, and that's how you know what the CEO of a corporation is. Many other items, like your character, he of course owns his stuff, that is meaningful to you, but your character is then owned by the Eve system, which is owned by none, and none of this is really very meaningful. It's just, as long as you know that owner names don't change, that's the biggest thing you can actually learn from this. Then there's the location. The location of an item denotes where it is. The locations are a type of items, as owners are a type of items. And when I was making this presentation, I realized that there's actually important tables missing in the SDE, and those are the table Eve owners and Eve locations, which actually help you differentiate between whether an item is an owner or a location. It's not going to be, like I said, very helpful, but at least you can look into the table and see, like, oh, okay, so there's a corporation and owners. Okay, corporations must be owners then. The locations are differentiated from other items by having an XYZ coordinate, because they are actually valid locations in space, and they can also be the locations of other items. And there's the annoying thing about characters. Characters aren't actually locations, they are owners, but when you inject a skill, you put the skill book into his head, so it's located there. It's kind of a special case, just ignore it, please. It ruins all the beautiful rules that I have in my mind. So here is kind of how this all comes together with using the flag as well, because locations aren't enough in and by themselves to tell you where within the location the item is, because you have, let's just think about this sample case over there, the Rifter. The Rifter, you'll see it's color-coded. I'm sorry for using red and green. I shouldn't do it, I know. So you have this Rifter there that's located within Jita, right here, as I told you earlier. It has then some item ID X, and there's a pilot within it whose location ID is X, and an afterburner, which is a module fitted, whose location ID is X, and a container whose location ID is also X. So this is not enough to actually tell a difference between whether the cargo is, sorry, whether the secure container is flying the ship or the pilot itself. So we have these flags over here to say something more about the location. The pilot is the pilot, the afterburner is in my slot 0, the SEC is the cargo, and the damsel, which is in the SEC, doesn't have any flag because there is no more meaningful information to be gleaned from that. If you're in a container, you're just in a container. There is nothing more to that. There's a little Amar joke down there. Ha ha ha. My mic got stuck in my beard. Okay, so locations being a part of all the items in Eve, which are owned by owners, which are also a part of all the items in Eve. If you ever try to actually look at the Tranquility database and request, a relational graph from it, you'll get a lot of nonsense because it's all quite circular at this point. Because this is the main table of Eve references itself over and over and over again. And then there's also a bunch of other non-items in the entire game. Like certificates, you might think that when you claim a certificate, you're actually claiming an item which is then, injected into your hat like a skill or something like that. You're just making a connection between your character ID and a certificate ID. And you can find the certificate IDs in the data dump as well as the required relationships between skills and other certificates, but it's really, really hard to get your head around it, as many people who have actually dug into it can attest to. There's weird rules with, look at it and cry. This is something that can be quite useful to you. If you would spend a lot of time looking at the static data dump, or data export, I'm sorry, you'll see that all the identities there are less than 90 million. And that's because at the dawn of the time, CCP decided that all statically authored content would have an item ID of less than 100 million, and then we had to bump that down a bit because we wanted to use the 90 to 100 million ranges for owners. This means that you can look at an item ID and know what you're looking at without actually having to check out the type ID. This also means that if you ever get a response from the API with an item ID or character ID or location ID or whatever, which is less than 90 million, you know you don't have to cross the wire at that point. So you can save yourself a lot of headache by just knowing this. Also, if you look at, just to come back to your issue with the container freighters, if you look at the station range there, you can see that 61 million to 64 million are player-created stations. You also see that the station range is nicely set out for you right there. So knowing this, it might help you to actually find those container freighters in the asset list, because you know the location is going to be in the range of either 60 to 61 million if it's a NPC station, or a 61 to... Yes. And actually, this is compounded further by the fact that you can't actually translate all location names anymore. I will add into the API a method just to called owner names and location names, which will only accept valid locations or valid owners. But it's going to be more efficient than the character names, because that has to do a lot of resource sacrifices to be able to service both types and owners and deleted owners and everything. But hopefully that will then help you if you have a list of these items, because you know that, of course, you know the type that you're looking for, and you know the location of them possibly, and then you can at least just request the names of these guys, and that should get you somewhere, possibly. Yeah, exactly. I can see there seems to be a disconnect of how to actually get this list. Maybe we can talk later or during the roundtable and hash something out to help you with this. So, why does this matter? It's because, well, if you know SQL, and you can just look at this is the difference of finding the assets of owner ID, whatever it says over there, in all stations. You can either do a join there, which is actually going to be less reads, but it's going to take a whole lot longer time. Or you can just use this knowledge. There's no way for the database to ever realize this, so you actually have to know this yourself. But if you know this, then you can optimize your queries a whole lot just by using the metadata within the item ID. And this 80% and 20% is just an estimate that Microsoft gave me when I ran the two queries side by side, of which is taking what part of the entire execution time. Handy. So, knowing all of this, how are we actually going to apply this? Actually, it doesn't assume understanding of programming basics anymore. I ripped out the coding example because I was really, really afraid that I would run out of time, but I seem to have ample time right now. So, you just have to ask yourself questions. There is, of course, sacrificial cost for using in-memory constructs rather than using your local storage, and there is sacrificial cost in using your local storage versus traversing the wire, and of course you also sacrifice stuff by going over the wire rather than going onto the storage, and there is really no silver bullet in this discussion. You have to know your application and how it's going to be used by your users in order to actually answer any of these questions. So, if you have an application which is working a lot with types, then it's probably a really good idea just to load up all the types into an in-memory structure rather than ever query anything about it. It is really basic. If you're working with owners a lot, you might not want to, like, in the end, if you have to keep every owner in Eve in memory, you're going to have issues with your application as well. So you might want to have some just-in-time population and a FIFO queue throwing out stuff that came in first, or try and implement some, priority queue based on the usage of the owner. Step in my beard again. There we go. And always consider, this use a local database rather than crossing the wire. You don't have to use a local database. You can go with some NoSQL solution or whatever. Just use the local storage whenever you can. So here is the query that we went over earlier in example 2, and I added this where category ID equals 9 and T type ID equals input parameter type ID. There's also this nifty little type prices table down there, which is colored up red. These are little optimizations that I'm stealing from CCP Atlas's lecture. So this type prices table is a good optimization because we don't actually allow you to query the actual market value of types to us. You all have bots which go over the market and dump down the market prices into memory, and then you reverse engineer that into some meaningful data. But here Atlas has pre-processed this table with price approximations, so he doesn't have to do any calculations on the server. It's I'm not going to be overly bothered if I get a plus minus 10% quote on my assets. So as long as I get a ballpark count. Which is also required because, as I said, the API doesn't expose this data. But the real stupid thing here is that this type ID parameter seems to imply that you're going to be asking the database frequently over and over again whenever you're looking at a type of a blueprint. You're going to be querying this data into the database. And if you're making an application which is working on blueprints a whole lot, that just doesn't make much sense. You're just going to be wasting a lot of time doing database IOs. Nobody likes wasting time. And now you have the question also of when to cross the wire and when to talk to your database. And just as we showed you on this original slide, you have no idea what's going on with our API at any given point. You might be putting yourself into a wait time of 6 minutes. So just avoid the API at whatever cost whenever you can. Build up your local data information. I did tell you that owners, they don't change names, so you can just build up as you have to query owner IDs, you can just build up your local storage of owner IDs and never ever query the API for that again. Maybe at some point somebody gets angry and says like, hey dude, my character was renamed to Galante Citizen, and then I had myself renamed over to this again. That's once every 2 or 3 blue moons or something like that. So it's the optimization you get from not querying the API over and over again is better than that one angry person. And even then, you can have a lifetime of a week or something instead. So then you update every week or something. Location names, like I said, they do change. I can rename my ship whatever I want, but it's a question of whether people actually really care about, at some point you'll get Prism Access Rifter, then I rename it to Uberboat 25, and do you really care that you don't see my new Uberboat name? Not very likely. Well, okay. But if you do, then you just deal with it. If not, then you just maybe tell people that like location names are subject to change in where it doesn't matter. So, as I already went over this already. You know that the items above the 90 million mark could change names, and you know that the items below the 90 million marks will not change names. So never ever query any identity below 90 millions to the API. Unless, of course, this all changes when you're on a mobile application where you don't have a proper storage behind you. And that's why we'll probably keep these type name lookups in the API still, just to support those guys. But yeah, there's always the question of these memory pressures, and there is really nothing that I can't give you a silver bullet. All I can do is actually get you to think about these things if you're not already doing it. I hope you're all already doing it. These are pretty much just best practices of development rather than me giving you any secret information. This is where my coding example used to be, but it's no longer here. And this is the basics of if you have to fetch something over the wire, cache it on your side for as long as you think you possibly can without annoying your users. This is what we do. This is why you always get this, list is only up to 5 minutes, the asset list, and I think the science and industry jobs listing as well, that it has, you just get a cast response from us in the end for some time until we have a reason to invalidate it, and otherwise we'd have to waste a lot more of resource powers into it. And to actually tie this all together, I really suggest you actually attend CCP Atlas's lecture. I know we've not been going very deeply into anything in these 2 lectures, but he is actually going to tie it all together and make it awesome, aren't you? Yes. So, you can always contact me through my EveGate profile. I'm also on IRC when I'm at work, but otherwise, questions? Comments?
You just mentioned the owner names will never get renamed, but what happens if a corporation closes the doors and somebody else has opened a corporation or an alliance with the same name? What happens then?
Then you have an item ID with the same name as another item ID in your database.
It's a duplicate and it's attended to.
Yes. The owners do not have to have unique names by definition. If you would have the Eve owners table in your static data export, you would see that there is no unique constraints to the name there, but whereas there is a unique constraint on the names in Eve names, because the unique names go in there. And once you delete a corporation, it's no longer located in Eve names. It's deleted from there. It's retained within the Eve owners, so we can always have a legacy record of owner names.
Any more questions?
It's tomorrow
at 11.
Yeah. After Charlie talks a bit about the API. No more questions?
This guy here is also an authority on the API since he's writing most of the code, so if you have any questions on the API, you can ask now, that's fine.
No.
Are we actually going to see CCP provided documentation on the static data dump and what the tables mean and how they interconnect at any time in the soon TM bracket period of time?
Well, I kind of consider that EPS data dump.sql to be documentation. But that's because I'm a programmer, and well, you're a programmer as well. But we're not really that big on documentation in CCP.
We noticed.
Yes, maybe I can get Charlie to write it up, and he'll learn something along the way. I'm sorry, I'm not gonna promise that we're gonna do documentation. You know, I'd just be, yes.
But for the static data export, we're going to follow up with some tutorials on the web and stuff, if you guys want us to. And I think actually seeing examples like Gunnar gave on how to fetch specific data is going to go a very long way in demystifying this entire thing for you.
Yo.
You said that all locations have X, Y, and Z coordinates. Are there any plans to expose that through the assets API?
There are no concrete plans for that, but if I would add in the location name lookup, I would probably include the XYZ coordinates within that at least.
Because I was thinking more along the lines of POSs and things. So you can actually work out
as I said, POSs are locations, so you would be able to make that API call to get the XYZ coordinates for that. But within the asset list itself, because not all items are actually locations, we would be wasting a lot of resources on doing redundant joins to return null for a lot of items, because you know most of the items your character has are not locations. Anything further? Oh, Charlie.
You know, I noticed nobody left. It's a joke.
No, I didn't actually expect it to.
Sorry, there was I think a dev blog recently about how you're changing the icon set thing again, like how to add the little tags in the corner, that kind of thing. So is the database changing? Like it just changed recently with how you pull the get the icon like IDs. Is that going to change again?
Are you talking about showing a difference between PPOs or BPCs, or?
No, sorry, like a Tech2 item versus a faction item, that kind of thing. And how each icon, like before.
Yeah, before you had to click it before the icon would show up, or.
Sorry, in the static image dump, there's only like a single type, like icon for a Tech1 blueprint, Tech2 blueprint, not blueprint, like an afterburner.
Okay. I'm not really familiar with the image stamp itself. I actually don't
made
handle
those
that.
changes, so I can answer that.
Okay.
But I don't know what you're talking about.
Okay.
No, actually we made the change a few weeks ago. So now each type ID in the game is represented by an icon. Whereas before we only had base icons, and you had to do the mapping yourself and add the little squiggly thing in the corner and stuff. Now whatever type ID you have, you do have a type ID underscore size.png image in the image export, and that's available on the website there.
Okay, thank you. So that is what I was asking.
And you can also, we've checked it in, and it's going to be released very soon. You can query the image server, the EVGate image server for all those icons as well. So you can save yourself some bandwidth and storage space and just get in directly there. Okay, so any more questions for us?
Yep.
It's amazing. I didn't understand a word.
About the image icon server, how stupid or evil can they be about it?
How evil can you be about scraping it and getting every type icon from it, etc.?
No, I'm saying I have a couple dynamic lists of items, for example, might be 100 items. That might be queried to your servers for 100 items X amount of times in an hour.
Yeah, I mean, if our server crashes, then we'll just fire some people and fix it. So don't worry about it. It's all on our CDN, and it has a lot of bandwidth, probably much more than your own server. So if you have a choice, you should probably go to ours.
Yeah, right now I have the type ID icon dump up, but my web host server basically sucks. So if you occasionally underload, it just doesn't find them.
Yeah. You should definitely go to ours then. It's an industry standard thing, and it's the same server that you're fetching all your avatar images from the game at a rate of a few 100,000 per hour. So feel free to abuse it as you will.
Well, thank you.
Oh no.
No further questions then.
Now for the test.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Anna.
Answers.